The orange flames danced against the twilight sky as my neighbors gathered around the fire pit, their laughter echoing across the lake. I had no idea that this simple moment of community joy would trigger the most vindictive, power-hungry HOA president our lakeside town had ever seen. By the time Margaret called me Chairwoman Hartwell was done with me, I'd learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting creative. My name is David, and 6 months ago, I inherited my grandfather's lake house in Pine Grove Shores, a small community of about 40 homes scattered along the pristine shoreline of Lake Serenity. The property had been in our family since the 1960s, long before the Homeowners Association existed, long before the manicured lawns and identical mailboxes transformed this place from a rustic retreat into suburbia by the water. The house itself was a modest 2-bedroom cabin with weathered cedar siding and a wraparound porch that faced the lake. But the real treasure was the backyard, a gentle slope that led down to a private dock, surrounded by towering pines and ancient oaks. My grandfather had built a simple stone fire pit there in the 1970s. Nothing fancy, just a circle of field stones where 3 generations of our family had roasted marshmallows and shared stories under the stars. When I moved in last spring, I decided to restore the fire pit to its former glory. I carefully reset the stones, cleared the weeds, and added a few log benches around the perimeter. It wasn't visible from the street, barely visible from the neighboring properties, and certainly not hurting anyone. The first time I lit it, the familiar smell of wood smoke mixed with the pine-scented evening air, and I felt like I was home. That's when I met the neighbors. The Johnsons from next door brought over a bottle of wine and stayed until midnight, sharing stories about their own memories of the lake. The young couple from across the cove, Sarah and Mike, paddled over in their kayaks with their kids. Even old Mr. Peterson, the gruff retiree from 3 houses down, wandered over with a thermos of coffee and stayed for 2 hours talking about fishing. For the first month, it was perfect, but I should have known that in a place where the HOA has rules about the exact shade of white, you can paint your mailbox post. A gathering place that brought people together would eventually draw unwanted attention. But I had no idea that Margaret Hartwell had been watching every single gathering through her binoculars, taking notes and planning her attack. Enter the villain. Margaret Hartwell lived in the largest house in the development, a sprawling colonial with columns that looked completely out of place among the rustic lake homes. She'd been HOA president for 8 years running, not because people liked her, but because no one else wanted the job badly enough to deal with her. At 62, she had silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, wore exclusively beige and navy blue outfits, and carried herself with the self-importance of someone who'd confused being in charge of a neighborhood association with running a small government. I first encountered her on a humid Tuesday evening in June. I was loading split oak into my wheelbarrow when I heard the distinctive click-clack of expensive heels on my gravel driveway. I looked up to see Margaret approaching, clipboard in hand, wearing a navy blazer despite the 80-degree weather. "Mr. Morrison, I presume?" she said, not waiting for an answer. "I'm Margaret Hartwell, president of the Pine Grove Shores Homeowners Association. We need to discuss your fire situation." I wiped my hands on my jeans and tried to keep my voice friendly. "Nice to meet you, Margaret. There's no situation, just a family fire pit that's been here for 50 years. Her eyes narrowed. "That may be, but you're hosting gatherings that violate multiple sections of our community guidelines. Section 4.2 prohibits outdoor assemblies without prior approval. Section 7.8 restricts open flames to designated areas. And Section 12.1 clearly states that any structure visible from neighboring properties requires architectural review." I felt my jaw clench. "It's not visible from the street, and it's barely visible from the lake." My grandfather. "What your grandfather did or didn't do is irrelevant," she cut me off. "The HOA was established in 1995, and all properties are bound by the current covenants, regardless of when they were purchased. She handed me a formal letter from her clipboard. You have 30 days to remove the fire pit and discontinue all unauthorized gatherings. I stared at the letter, feeling heat rise in my chest. This is ridiculous. We're not bothering anyone. If anything, we're bringing the community together. Margaret's smile was colder than the lake in January. Mr. Morrison, I've lived here for 15 years, and I can assure you that what brings this community together is respect for rules and property values, not campfires and chaos. She turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and that pile of firewood? Section 9.3 requires all stored materials to be screened from view. You'll want to address that as well. As I watched her click-clack back down my driveway, I crumpled the letter in my fist. 30 days. 30 days to remove a fire pit that had brought more joy to this neighborhood in 2 months than Margaret's iron-fisted rule had probably brought in 8 years. Little did I know that Margaret had already scheduled a special emergency session of the HOA board for the following evening, and I wasn't invited. I spent the next day calling every member of the HOA board I could track down. Out of 7 members, I managed to reach 4. The conversations were eerily similar, polite, apologetic, and completely unhelpful. I'm sorry, David, but Margaret runs a tight ship, said Jennifer Chen, the secretary. Well, she knows the rules better than anyone. I wish I could help, admitted Tom Rodriguez, the treasurer, but she's got all the documentation. Says you're in clear violation. The most revealing conversation was with Bill McKenzie, who'd been on the board longer than anyone except Margaret herself. Listen, kid, he said in a low voice. Margaret doesn't like it when people gather without her permission. She sees it as a challenge to her authority. My advice? Keep your head down and follow the rules. But these rules are insane, I protested. A fire pit that's been here for decades. Doesn't matter. She's got the HOA lawyer on speed dial, and trust me, you don't want to go down that road. She's sued 3 homeowners in the past 5 years. 1 every time. That evening, I decided to attend the next HOA meeting, scheduled for the following Thursday. If Margaret wanted to play by the rules, I'd learn the rules and beat her at her own game. But when Thursday came, I discovered that the meeting location had been temporarily changed to Margaret's living room due to scheduling conflicts with the community center. The meeting that was supposed to start at 7 o'clock was already underway when I arrived at 6:55. Through Margaret's front window, I could see 6 board members sitting in a semicircle around her coffee table, reviewing documents and nodding as she spoke. I rang the doorbell. Margaret opened the door with a look of surprise that was about as genuine as a $3 bill. Oh, Mr. Morrison, I wasn't expecting you. The meeting was posted for 7 o'clock, I said, checking my watch. Yes, well, we started a few minutes early to accommodate everyone's schedule. Please come in. I stepped into her immaculate living room, where everything was beige, navy, or cream, and every surface gleamed like a furniture showroom. The board members looked up with expressions ranging from sympathetic to uncomfortable. We were just discussing your situation, Margaret said, settling back into her chair like a queen on her throne. The board has reviewed the relevant sections of our covenants, and we're unanimous in our position that the fire pit constitutes a violation. Unanimous? I looked around the room. Without hearing my side? Jennifer Chen shifted uncomfortably. Margaret presented a very thorough case. I have photos, Margaret continued, producing a manila folder. Evidence of multiple violations. Unauthorized assemblies, fire hazards, stored materials, and noise disturbances. She spread the photos across her coffee table like a prosecutor presenting evidence. They were clearly taken from her second-floor window with a telephoto lens, me lighting the fire pit, neighbors sitting around it, kids roasting marshmallows, people laughing and talking. These look like people enjoying themselves, I said. These look like violations, Margaret replied sharply. Section 4.2, Section 7.8, Section 12.1, and now I can add Section 6.7, excessive noise after 9 p.m. She pointed to a photo time stamped at 9:23 p.m. Clear violation of quiet hours. I felt like I was in a kangaroo court. This is my property. These are my neighbors. We're not hurting anyone. You're hurting property values, Margaret said. You're creating precedent for others to ignore our rules. And you're disturbing the peace and tranquility that our residents expect and deserve. Bill Mackenzie finally spoke up. Margaret, maybe we could work out some kind of compromise. The rules don't provide for compromise, she cut him off. Mr. Morrison has 2 weeks remaining to comply with our initial notice. If he fails to do so, we'll have no choice but to pursue legal action. The meeting ended 10 minutes later with a 6-1 vote to uphold the violation notice. Bill was the only dissenting vote. As I walked back to my car, Margaret followed me outside. Mr. Morrison, she called out, her voice now dripping with false concern. I hope you understand that this isn't personal. I'm simply doing my job, protecting our community standards. I turned to face her. Your job is supposed to be serving the community, not ruling it. Her mask of politeness slipped for just a moment. This community elected me to maintain order and preserve property values. You're little. Campfire gatherings may seem charming to you, but they represent chaos, and I will not allow chaos to take root in Pine Grove Shores. As I drove away, I noticed Margaret was already back on her phone, her voice carrying across the evening air. Whatever she was planning next would make the HOA meeting look like a friendly chat. The next morning, I woke up to find a certified letter taped to my front door. It wasn't from the HOA, it was from Brennan, Walsh & Associates, attorneys at law. Dear Mr. Morrison, we represent the Pine Grove Shores Homeowners Association in the matter of covenant violations occurring at 247 Lakeshore Drive. This letter serves as formal notice that you are in material breach of your community's declaration of covenants, conditions, and restrictions. I had to read it 3 times before the full impact hit me. Margaret wasn't just asking me to remove the fire pit anymore. She was demanding immediate cessation of all unauthorized gatherings, removal of the fire pit within 10 days, payment of $500 in fines already assessed, and attorney's fees of $1,200. But the real kicker was the final paragraph. Please be advised that failure to comply will result in the association seeking injunctive relief and additional monetary damages, up to and including foreclosure proceedings to satisfy any judgment obtained against you. Foreclosure. She was threatening to take my grandfather's house over a fire pit. I called my own lawyer, Janet Summers, who'd helped me with the inheritance paperwork. After I read her the letter, there was a long silence. David, I have to ask, is this fire pit really worth fighting over? It's not about the fire pit anymore, I said. It's about a power-hungry HO, a president who thinks she can terrorize people into submission. Well, she can, Janet said bluntly. HOAs have broad authority to enforce their covenants, and if the fire pit violates those covenants, but does it? I mean, really? This thing has been here since 1975. That doesn't matter if it violates current rules. Look, I can represent you, but it's going to be expensive. HOA litigation can drag on for months, sometimes years. And even if you win, you're still stuck living next to these people. I spent the rest of the day walking around the lake, trying to think clearly. The afternoon sun glittered off the water, and I could hear kids laughing at the community beach on the far shore. This place was supposed to be peaceful, a retreat from the chaos of city life. Instead, I was being dragged into a legal battle over the simple act of bringing neighbors together. That evening, I decided to light the fire pit one more time. If Margaret was going to sue me, she might as well have something worth suing over. Sarah and Mike from across the cove were the first to arrive, followed by the Johnsons with a bag of marshmallows. Old Mr. Peterson shuffled down from his house with his usual thermos of coffee. Word had spread about Margaret's legal threat, and instead of scaring people away, it seemed to have the opposite effect. "This is ridiculous," Sarah said, settling onto one of the log benches. "We've lived here for 3 years, and this is the most fun we've had. The kids love it." "Margaret's just on a power trip," agreed Tom Johnson. "She tried to make us remove our bird feeder last year because it wasn't architecturally consistent with the neighborhood aesthetic." "A bird feeder?" "She fined the Petersons $50 for leaving their garbage can out 6 hours past pickup time," added Mike. 6 hours? As the fire crackled and the conversation flowed, I felt a strange sense of calm. Whatever happened with the lawyers and the HOA this moment was real. This connection was real. And Margaret couldn't take that away, no matter how many legal briefs she filed. Around 9:30, just as we were starting to wind down, Mr. Peterson pointed toward Margaret's house. "Looks like the warden's keeping watch." I turned to see a figure silhouetted in Margaret's second-floor window, clearly visible against the lit room behind her. She was holding something binoculars, probably, or maybe a camera with a telephoto lens. "Let her watch," I said, adding another log to the fire. This is still America, last I checked. But as the evening ended and my neighbors headed home, I couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret was planning something bigger than lawyers and legal threats. The way she'd stood in that window, perfectly still, perfectly focused, reminded me of a predator watching prey. I was right to be worried. The next morning, I'd discover that Margaret had called the county fire marshal, claiming I was operating an illegal and dangerous open burn facility in a residential area. Fire Marshal Rodriguez arrived at 8:30 a.m. sharp, driving a white county truck with official red stripes. He was a compact, no-nonsense man in his 50s who looked like he'd rather be dealing with actual emergencies than HOA complaints. "Mr. Morrison? I'm Fire Marshal Rodriguez. We received a complaint about an unpermitted fire pit on your property." I led him around to the backyard, where my grandfather's modest stone circle sat cold and innocent in the morning light. Rodriguez walked around it slowly, examining the construction, the clearance from nearby trees, the proximity to structures. "How long has this been here?" he asked. "Since the mid-70s. My grandfather built it." He nodded, pulling out a measuring tape. "Stone construction, good clearance, reasonable distance from structures." He made some notes on his clipboard. "Who made the complaint?" "I think you know who made the complaint." A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Mrs. Hartwell was very thorough in her description of the fire hazard you're apparently creating. According to her, this constitutes a major threat to neighborhood safety." Rodriguez spent another 20 minutes examining the fire pit, the surrounding area, and taking photos. Finally, he closed his clipboard and looked at me directly. "Mr. Morrison, I've been doing this job for 18 years. I've seen real fire hazards, overloaded electrical panels, improperly stored chemicals, buildings with no sprinkler system. This," he gestured toward the fire pit, "this is not a fire hazard. It's actually better built than most commercial fire pits I see." Relief washed over me. "So I'm in the clear?" "Legally, yes. You don't need a permit for a small residential fire pit that meets safety requirements, which this does. But," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "Mrs. Hartwell mentioned that you might be operating this as a commercial gathering space." "Commercial? I have neighbors over 4 or more?" "I know. But she claims you're hosting regular events, charging admission, running an illegal business." He held up his hand as I started to protest. "I don't believe that for a second, but if she files a formal complaint alleging commercial use, the county has to investigate." That means inspectors, paperwork hearings. I felt the trap closing around me. Even when Margaret was wrong, she could use the bureaucracy as a weapon. However, Rodriguez continued, there is one thing you should know. Mrs. Hartwell asked me specifically about the definition of recreational fire versus bonfire. She seemed very interested in the regulations around larger fires. Why would she care about that? I'm not sure, but she asked about the permit requirements for community events involving open fires. Specifically, she wanted to know what would happen if someone organized a large gathering with a bonfire without proper permits. A chill ran down my spine. Margaret was fishing for ammunition, looking for ways to escalate this beyond a simple HOA dispute. After Rodriguez left, I spent the afternoon researching fire regulations and HOA law. What I discovered was disturbing. Margaret was right about one thing: the county did have strict regulations about large fires and public gatherings. If she could somehow characterize my small neighborhood gatherings as events requiring permits, she could bring the full weight of county government down on me. But as I dug deeper into the regulations, I started to see something else. Something that might just give me the leverage I needed. That evening, I called Janet Summers again. I want to fight this, I told her, but I need to understand all my options. David, I appreciate your principles, but… Janet, what if I told you that Margaret might be violating HOA law herself? There was a pause. What do you mean? I've been reading the Pine Grove Shores covenants. All of them. And I found some interesting things. Did you know that HOA board meetings are supposed to be open to all homeowners? And that major decisions require 30 days written notice. Go on. Margaret's been holding emergency sessions in her living room with minimal notice. She's making unilateral decisions and then getting rubber stamp approval from a board she handpicked. And here's the kicker: she's been using HOA funds to pay for legal actions without proper board authorization. Janet's voice perked up with interest. If you can prove that, we might have grounds for a counterclaim: breach of fiduciary duty, violation of nonprofit governance requirements. There's more. The original covenants, from 1995, have a grandfather clause for existing structures. My fire pit predates the HOA by 20 years. That's a strong argument, if you can document it. I can. My grandfather kept meticulous records. I've got photos, receipts, even a newspaper clipping from 1976 about a neighborhood barbecue held around the fire pit. For the first time since this whole mess started, I felt like I had a fighting chance. But as I hung up the phone, I couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret was still one step ahead of me. My instincts were right. While I was researching HOA law, Margaret was crafting her masterpiece, a plan so deviously clever that it would either destroy me completely or backfire in the most spectacular way imaginable. 3 days later, I received what I initially thought was good news. A hand-delivered invitation to a special community meeting scheduled for the upcoming Saturday at 2 p.m. in the Pine Grove Shores Community Center. The agenda listed only one item: discussion of community standards and property use violations. But something felt off. Margaret never held community meetings on weekends, and she certainly never invited the entire neighborhood to discuss specific violations. This felt like a trap. I spent Friday evening preparing my defense. I organized my grandfather's documents, printed copies of the relevant covenant sections, and prepared a timeline showing that the fire pit predated the HOA by 2 decades. If Margaret wanted a public showdown, I'd give her one. Saturday morning dawned crisp and clear, with that perfect autumn light that made the lake look like a sheet of polished silver. I arrived at the community center 15 minutes early to find the parking lot already half full. As I walked toward the building, I could see neighbors I recognized, some who'd sat around my fire pit, others I'd only nodded to in passing. Inside, Margaret had arranged the room like a courtroom. She sat at a table facing rows of folding chairs, with the other board members flanked on either side of her. A laptop and projector were set up, along with a microphone and speaker system that seemed excessive for a room that seated maybe 50 people. Margaret wore her most formal navy suit and had her silver hair styled in what I could only describe as a power bob. She looked like she was running for office, rather than discussing a neighborhood dispute. As residents filed in, I noticed something interesting. The people who'd attended my fire pit gatherings all sat in the back rows, while the front was filled with neighbors I didn't recognize, mostly older residents who lived in the more expensive houses near Margaret's. At exactly 2 p.m., Margaret called the meeting to order with a sharp tap of her gavel. "Thank you all for attending this special community meeting," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone. "As you know, we're here to discuss a serious matter affecting our neighborhood safety, property values, and quality of life." She clicked to her first PowerPoint slide, maintaining community standards in Pine Grove Shores. For 8 years, your HOA board has worked tirelessly to preserve the character and value of our community. We've maintained our beautiful common areas, enforced architectural standards that protect property values, and created a peaceful environment where families can thrive. Murmurs of approval from the front rows. However, recent events have threatened to undermine everything we've built together. Click. The next slide showed a photo of my fire pit with the title "Unauthorized Fire Hazard." My stomach dropped. This wasn't going to be a discussion. It was going to be a public execution. As many of you know, a resident has constructed an unpermitted fire pit and has been hosting regular gatherings that violate multiple sections of our community covenants. Click. More photos of my neighbors around the fire pit, all taken from Margaret's window with telephoto precision. These gatherings have resulted in noise violations, parking issues, and safety concerns. But more importantly, they represent a fundamental disrespect for the rules that bind us together as a community. She was building her case methodically, presenting me as a scofflaw who thought he was above the rules that everyone else followed. The front rows nodded along with every point. The resident in question has been given multiple opportunities to comply with our reasonable requests. Instead, he has chosen to hire a lawyer and threaten legal action against your volunteer board members. That got a reaction, gasps, and headshakes from the audience. Margaret had just painted me as the aggressor, the outsider who was attacking the very people trying to protect the community. Which brings us to today's announcement. Margaret's smile was pure venom. After extensive consultation with our legal counsel, the board has voted to pursue all available remedies to protect our community standards. This includes immediate legal action to remove the fire hazard, recover damages, and ensure compliance with all community covenants. The front rows erupted in applause. Margaret basked in the approval, letting the moment stretch before continuing. But that's not all. We've also learned that the resident has been operating what appears to be an unlicensed commercial gathering space, hosting regular events without proper permits or insurance. We've reported this to the appropriate county authorities. My hands clenched in my lap. She was lying outright now, but in this setting, with this audience, her lies sounded like responsible community leadership. Therefore, effective immediately, all gatherings at the property in question are prohibited pending resolution of these violations. Any resident found participating in unauthorized activities may face their own covenant violations. She was isolating me, cutting me off from my neighbors with threats and intimidation. Now, Margaret continued, I'd like to give the resident an opportunity to address the community and explain his actions. All eyes turned to me. I could feel the weight of the room's judgment, the carefully orchestrated hostility that Margaret had constructed. This was her moment of triumph, the public humiliation that would end my resistance once and for all. I stood up slowly, my prepared notes suddenly feeling inadequate in my hands. But what Margaret didn't know was that I'd been planning my own surprise. And unlike her carefully staged performance, mine was going to be completely genuine. I walked to the front of the room with my folder of documents, feeling every eye in the community center focused on me. Margaret leaned back in her chair with the satisfied expression of someone who just delivered a knockout punch. "Thank you, Margaret, for that creative interpretation of events," I began, setting up my own materials on the podium. "I'd like to start by addressing some factual errors in your presentation." I clicked to my first slide, a black and white photo from 1976, showing my grandfather and a group of neighbors gathered around the newly built fire pit. This photo appeared in the Lake County Gazette 50 years ago, with the caption "Pine Grove residents enjoy community barbecue at the Morrison family's traditional fire pit." The fire pit in question was built in 1975, 20 years before this HOA existed. Murmurs from the audience. I had their attention now. According to the original Pine Grove Shores covenants, filed in 1995, I held up the document. Section 15.3 clearly states that existing structures and improvements predating the establishment of this association shall be deemed compliant and grandfathered under these covenants. Margaret's confident expression flickered slightly. But let's talk about rules, since that seems to be Mrs. Hartwell's favorite topic. I clicked to my next slide. Did you know that HOA board meetings are required by law to be open to all homeowners? Or that major decisions require 30 days written notice to the community? I looked directly at Margaret. How much notice did you give before moving last week's board meeting to your living room? How many homeowners knew that meeting was taking place? The murmurs were getting louder now, and I could see neighbors in the back rows leaning forward with interest. And speaking of rules, let's examine Mrs. Hartwell's interpretation of commercial activity. According to county regulations, commercial activity requires the exchange of money, goods, or services. Having neighbors over for s'mores and conversation doesn't qualify any more than hosting a birthday party or a book club would. Margaret stood up, her face flushed. "Mr. Morrison, this is not the appropriate forum for—" "Actually, Margaret, this is exactly the appropriate forum. You called this meeting to discuss my alleged violations. I'm simply providing context." I clicked to my final slide, a detailed financial breakdown. But here's what I find most interesting about Mrs. Hartwell's concern for community rules. Did you know that she spent over $3,000 in HOA funds on legal fees for this dispute? Money that could have gone to playground maintenance, landscaping, or community events? The room erupted. Neighbors started talking over each other, demanding answers from the board members who suddenly looked very uncomfortable. "And here's the kicker," I continued, raising my voice over the commotion. "Mrs. Hartwell authorized those legal expenses without board approval, in direct violation of the fiduciary responsibility requirements outlined in our HOA charter." Margaret was fully standing now, her face red with anger. "This is completely inappropriate. You are disrupting an official." "An official what, Margaret? A kangaroo court designed to publicly shame me into submission? A one-sided presentation where you get to make accusations without allowing for response?" I turned to address the full room. Here's what this is really about, folks. Mrs. Hartwell is upset that neighbors are gathering and having fun without her permission. She's upset that people are connecting with each other instead of following her arbitrary interpretation of rules that don't even apply. The audience was completely engaged now, the artificial divide between front and back rows starting to blur as neighbors turned to talk to each other. But you know what? I'm not here to attack Margaret or argue about legal technicalities. I'm here because I believe our community deserves better than fear-based leadership and petty power games. I closed my folder and looked around the room at faces I was beginning to recognize. So here's what I propose. Instead of fighting about a fire pit that's been bringing neighbors together for 50 years, why don't we embrace what makes this community special? Why don't we celebrate the connections we've built instead of tearing them down? Margaret found her voice again. This is completely out of order. You cannot just... Actually, Margaret, I can. Because unlike your secret board meetings and unilateral decisions, this is a public forum where every homeowner has the right to speak. I smiled, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me. Which brings me to my final point. Next Saturday, I'm hosting a community bonfire on the public beach area, fully permitted, fully legal, fully open to every resident of Pine Grove Shores. We'll have music, food, and activities for kids. Consider it a celebration of what this community can be when we focus on bringing people together instead of driving them apart. The room exploded with conversation. Neighbors were already making plans, talking about what they'd bring, asking for details. Even some of the people from the front rows seemed intrigued. Margaret was speechless, her carefully orchestrated ambush completely derailed by a simple invitation to community celebration. But as I packed up my materials and prepared to leave, I caught sight of Margaret's expression. The shock and anger were already being replaced by something much more dangerous: cold, calculating fury. I'd won this battle, but the war was far from over. The week leading up to the community bonfire was a whirlwind of activity. Word spread beyond Pine Grove Shores to neighboring communities around the lake. The local newspaper picked up the story, framing it as a feel-good piece about community spirit triumphing over bureaucratic pettiness. Sarah and Mike organized a food committee. The Johnsons coordinated activities for kids, and even old Mr. Peterson volunteered to help with setup. But Margaret wasn't sitting idle. She spent the week making phone calls, sending emails, and filing complaints with every county department she could think of. The fire marshal had to make 3 additional visits to verify that our permit was in order. The sheriff's department sent a patrol car by twice to investigate noise complaints that turned out to be completely fabricated. Even the health department showed up to inspect our food service operation, which consisted of hot dogs and hamburgers cooked on a simple grill. Each inspection came back clean. Each complaint was dismissed. Margaret's desperation was becoming obvious to everyone, including her own board members. On Friday evening, the day before the bonfire, I was surprised to see Bill McKenzie walking down my driveway. "Got a minute to talk?" he asked, looking uncomfortable. We sat on my porch, watching the sun set over the lake. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "I've been on that board for 6 years, and I let Margaret turn me into a rubber stamp. This whole fire pit thing, it was never about rules or safety. It was about control. I know." She's lost 3 board members this week. Jennifer Chen resigned yesterday, said she didn't want to be part of Margaret's personal vendetta. Tom Rodriguez is talking about stepping down too. Bill pulled out an envelope, which is why the remaining board members asked me to give you this. Inside was a formal letter of apology from the Pine Grove Shores HOA board, along with a check reimbursing me for my legal expenses and a written acknowledgement that my fire pit was grandfathered and compliant with all community covenants. "Margaret doesn't know about this yet," Bill said. "We voted 4-2 this afternoon. She and 1 other member were the only holdouts." I stared at the letter, feeling a mix of vindication and exhaustion. What happens now? There's going to be a special election for board president next month. Margaret can run again if she wants, but I don't think she'll get many votes. People are tired of the drama. Saturday dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for a bonfire. By 5 o'clock, the public beach was transformed. We'd set up picnic tables, strung lights between the trees, and built a magnificent bonfire in the designated fire ring. The smell of grilling food mixed with wood smoke and pine needles, creating an atmosphere that was quintessentially lakeside autumn. The turnout exceeded my wildest expectations. Not just Pine Grove Shores residents, but families from across the lake. Kids ran around with sparklers while adults gathered in clusters, talking and laughing. The local bluegrass band set up near the water and filled the evening air with music that drifted across the lake like a celebration of community itself. Around 7:30, I noticed a familiar figure standing at the edge of the beach area. Margaret Hartwell, dressed in her usual navy blazer, watching the festivities with an expression of undisguised bitterness. She stood there for maybe 10 minutes, isolated and alone, while the community she tried to control celebrated around her. Then she turned and walked away, her heels clicking on the pavement as she headed back to her empty house. I felt a moment of genuine pity for her. This was what she could have had: a community that respected her, neighbors who appreciated her efforts, a legacy of bringing people together instead of driving them apart. Instead, she'd chosen control over connection, fear over trust, rules over relationships. The bonfire burned late into the evening, with neighbors sharing stories and making plans for future gatherings. As the flames died down to glowing embers,